Ross is a professor in economics at ANU and in business and economics at the Uni of Melbourne. He was principal economic advisor to Prime Minister Bob Hawke, and he's also author of numerous books. I actually have a copy of his latest one here, Superpower Transformation, Making Australia's Zero Carbon Future, for whoever asks the first question. So make sure you have a think of one there. I'd like you to welcome Ross onto the stage. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. Great to be back in Dubbo, this dynamic inland city. It's done very well over recent decades, and its future is even bigger as Australia embraces the opportunities of the zero carbon economy. As Karen showed in her pictures from the farm, Australia's already suffered a lot from climate change. And if the world didn't do anything about growing greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere, then we could expect continuing worsening of those impacts and eventually catastrophic effects on farming in Australia. The good news is that the world's decided to do something about the problem, all of the countries of the United Nations at Glasgow committed to trying to hold temperature increases to 1.5 degrees on average over the world above pre-industrial levels. If we succeed in that, then most of the damage from climate change is already with us, because the average over the world so far is a bit over 1.1 degrees, a bit more on average in Australia, but that's the average over the world. If we can hold the temperature increases to 1.5 degrees, most of the damage has already been done. The bad news is that lots of people still don't take very seriously this commitment. There was an announcement by Woodside a couple of days ago of new oil production in the Gulf of Mexico, which really is premised on expectation that the world will fail in those objectives and there'll still be strong demand for oil in the 2040s. And I noticed that Alan Finkel, the former chief scientist, in his recent book was fairly pessimistic about achieving 1.5. Well, let's be clear, if we fail, life's very tough for farming in Australia. But the good news is there's no reason to fail. To achieve 1.5 degrees, we've got to keep global greenhouse gas emissions, get them down to zero by 2050, because some of the developing countries will inevitably take a bit longer. The developed countries, like Australia, have to be net zero before that by 2045. Gradually, over the past 15 years, as I've been working on these issues, it's become clear that the world achieving that objective, and Australia being fully committed to being part of the global effort, creates great economic opportunity for Australia. Net zero by 2045 for the developed countries, 2050 for the world as a whole is feasible. We've got the technologies now. It doesn't require new technologies. New technologies will make it cheaper, but we don't have to rely on them. It will require enormous commitments of capital. In this book, I show that Australia embracing the superpower opportunity will require investment of about 5.5% of GDP for a generation. That's daunting, but it's possible. The world is not short of capital at the moment where the business case exists, and that's actually no more than we were investing in restructuring the Australian economy to service the mining needs of China during the China resources boom. It requires a similar sort of effort on a sustained basis, but it's feasible. It's feasible to maintain growth in living standards in Australia and in the world while achieving net zero, while improving rather than damaging other aspects of the environment, because many of the things we need to achieve net zero emissions will be helpful to environmental sustainability in other ways. If the world embraces this opportunity, Australia has great advantages because we can decarbonise our economy more cheaply than other countries for reasons I'll outline in a moment. That will give us new competitive advantages in agriculture and in other goods, because other countries will spend more getting to net zero in these industries than we will. If we embrace the opportunity, as I discuss in the Superpower Transformation, we can look forward to ending what's been a decade of stagnation of living standards in Australia. We can look forward to a generation of rising employment, economic activity and incomes, and for the first time in federation, the centre of gravity of Australian economic growth will be rural and provincial Australia and not the great cities of Australia. The elements of the new opportunity, the elements of rural growth, are several. In some ways, the most obvious when you're here in Dubbo is the investment in new solar and wind and transmission capacity. And this is going to be important. It's not a one-off hit like building a mine, which after it's all over you get a slump over it, because Australia will need to be expanding its capacity of solar and wind and systems to move it around and to store it for the next 30 or 40 years. We'll end up with an electricity system many tens of times bigger than the system now, so it's not a one-off boost to activity, it's continuous. But more important for that in rural Australia is that having the low-cost renewable energy is going to give us opportunities to build new manufacturing and processing industries which are naturally located near the sources of renewable energy in rural Australia. And in addition, farming will be transformed by new opportunities for achieving value from storing carbon in the landscape, in plants and soils, and for sustainably growing biomass as an input to zero-carbon industries. This will support the old agricultural and pastoral industries and not compete with it. It can be focused on using agricultural wastes or on using land that has low productivity in current activities. At the broadest level, Australia has 5 great advantages in the zero-carbon world, advantages over all other countries. We've got by far the best combinations of solar and wind resources relative to the size of our economy, so we are naturally an exporter of goods embodying energy. We've got more minerals and other raw materials requiring energy for processing than other countries. We are by far the world's biggest exporter of minerals that require a lot of processing before they are energy and processing before they eventually are used. And at the moment, we send those raw materials abroad in raw forms. The economically efficient way of sending them abroad will be as processed materials in the zero-carbon economy. We've got distinctly the world's best resources of energy transition minerals, those minerals which are needed in much higher proportions in the zero emissions economy than in the old fossil energy economy, because they're needed in the batteries, the electric cars, the electric tractors, the transmission lines, and the other infrastructure of the new economy. And these resources are scattered through rural and provincial Australia, some of them quite close to here, rare earths, copper resources not very far away. Australia's advantages in storing carbon in the landscape and growing biomass sustainably and harvesting it sustainably as inputs into zero emissions industry are huge. We've got 10 times as much woodlands per head of population that's available for storing carbon and for sustainably growing biomass for zero carbon industry, 10 times as much per head as the developed world as a whole. The developed world has much more than the developing world as a whole. This is a very important advantage in the zero emissions economy. And the fifth advantage is that our established infrastructure and skills for the old export industries, agriculture and pastoral industries, mining, metallurgy, and forestry are of immense value in the zero carbon world. So the new industries, well, first we will strengthen our existing industries by providing additional income streams by using with greater value land that's not highly productive in current uses. We will become more competitive in the established agricultural industries. The big high-value food markets of the world, for example, are in Europe and Northeast Asia, Japan, Korea and China, and right through Europe. They will have to decarbonise. It will be much more expensive for them to decarbonise than for us. That will raise prices in those markets. It will make Australian production for export more profitable if we embrace the opportunities. To be part of this new world, we're going to have to, at a relatively early stage, have zero emissions supply chains in all of our export industries. That's quite a challenge, but it's one that we're very well placed to meet. Europe is going to put special taxes on food and other products that have carbon in their supply chains from the end of 2025. The United States is working on similar arrangements. Korea and Japan will reorient their policies in that direction to take advantage of, well, really to avoid exclusion from the American and European markets. But we should not see this as a great threat. We should see it as opportunity because we can decarbonise our farming supply chains more cheaply than other countries. The big farm inputs, fertilisers, transport fuels, for those industries like dairy with a lot of costs of processing, the costs of fuel for energy for processing, all of these things can be produced at much lower cost in rural Australia than in our markets for rural produce. This is another source of competitive advantage. For example, fertiliser, major input into broadacre farming and horticulture all over Australia. Take urea, which is the largest volume fertiliser needed in huge quantities in our grain and our horticulture. We import over 2 million tonnes a year. 90% of our use is imports. It's produced in, it used to be produced in China, Russia, the Ukraine and the Middle East to export to Australia. It's become very much more expensive, and suppliers become less reliable as China has decided not to export emissions-intensive things so that it can reduce its own emissions, and as the Black Sea, Russia and Ukraine have been disrupted by the Russian invasion of Ukraine. This looks like a big vulnerability if we continue to rely on the high emissions imports from other countries. The good news is that decentralised production in rural Australia, in a number of different locations which have good renewable energy resources, can supply zero emissions urea more cheaply than we can import from these increasingly unreliable sources of supply. Similarly, transport fuels and fuels for processing farm products, the transition to electric vehicles and for use of green fuels is going to, over time, reduce costs, not in the first instance, but fundamentally the costs of the new technology are lower because the machines, the electric motor is simpler than the internal combustion motor, many fewer parts. It's going to end up being substantially cheaper when your fuel is coming from the wind and the sun. Operating costs are very low. In Australia, much lower than other countries. This becomes a source of low-cost decarbonisation of the supply chain. This is going to be, decarbonising the supply chains, a source of new dynamism for towns in rural Australia in supplying the zero emissions inputs. It's a very wide range of chemical industries that will depend on renewable energies to produce green hydrogen and also biomass to produce pure carbon, char, bio-oil or biogas in various forms. Once you have these inputs, you are at a globally competitive price. You are globally competitive in production of nitrogenous fertilizers, of a wide range of liquid fuels, as well as electricity itself. And the decentralized industries are going to be very important for growth in towns like this one. The opportunity in sequestering carbon in soils and plants and sustainably growing biomass is going to be very large, but it's going to require great innovation. We need to understand much more than we do now about how we can build up carbon in soils, how we can increase the carbon stock in plants. That requires research and development. The whole of the history of Australian modern agriculture and pastoral activity is a history of research and innovation. That same tradition will be a source of strength as we make use of the new opportunities. And by increasing the carbon in soils by a range of mechanisms, we'll find that we improve soil fertility and retention of moisture, increase productivity of existing farm systems, as well as developing new sources of income. So what do we need to do to grasp this opportunity? What are the conditions for success? First of all, across Australia, we need a shared, clear vision of where we are going and the nature of the opportunity, and conferences like this can help to build that shared vision. We need that shared vision across governments at all levels, federal, state and local. We need it across business. We need it across our labour force. We need it across our communities, including, very importantly, our Indigenous communities. The location of the new opportunities in inland Australia means that Indigenous communities are going to be important participants in decisions, and it's crucial that from the beginning they are deeply involved in decisions. We're going to need rigorous accounting for carbon. It's a nuisance, but rigour so that the whole world can see that Australia takes these issues seriously, that you can believe what Australians say about a zero emissions climate change is going to be crucial for making use of the new export opportunities. And we're going to need to lead the world in innovation, in developing more effective landscape carbon accounting mechanisms. I've talked in my recent books about comprehensive carbon accounting, where we get away from the narrow methodologies that are currently used for granting credits for carbon in soils and plants towards comprehensive carbon accounting. We've got a stronger interest in the world getting that right than other countries, because we're potentially a very large exporter of the products of this work, so that we've got an interest in getting that right. It's essential that we're seen as being strongly committed ourselves to early achievement of net zero carbon. Otherwise, our products will not have easy access to the high-value markets in Europe and Northeast Asia. It's essential that we remain committed to open trade, free trade, both on the import and the export side. Quite strong pressures in the world at the moment, back to protectionism, back to discrimination in trade, playing favourites in trade. We will do best in making use of this new opportunity by being seen as a country that has open trade with all of the sources of supply, all of the markets of the world. We're going to need a focused trade policy to take advantage of the opportunity. Above all, we need a dynamic market economy in rural and provincial Australia to innovate, to take advantage of new opportunities, to do things in different ways. This is an old strength of rural Australia, so one that I'm confident will bring to bear on this new challenge. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ross. It's fantastic to hear you outlining that new vision, and it's pretty exciting. I'll go to questions to the audience, but I'll just ask a quick one first. What are your thoughts on how farmers will achieve electrification of farms when a lot of us are on skinny lines and swirl lines?
Karen, it's not going to be the same answer for every farm. There are some parts of Australia that are best served by the established network, and they're just making sure that we're pricing access to the services correctly and upgrading them efficiently will give the opportunity for interaction with the grid. But it's not going to be economic to maintain the current system of skinny swirl lines, very unreliable, enormously expensive to maintain. The subsidies that state governments have put into maintaining that system will often be more effective, provided in provision of support for farmers and decentralised communities supplying their own on-farm electricity and storage. This will be a much more reliable and much cheaper source of electricity than connection through unreliable thin lines in many parts of decentralised Australia.
Thank you. Now we'll just go.
Ross, that's great. Sandy Gray from Gaia. I'm just wondering about a lot of farming people, agriculture here obviously, the balance between growing crops for fuel and growing crops for bioenergy and growing crops for food, obviously. So where are your thoughts around that?
I chaired for many years the board of the International Food Policy Research Institute based in Washington, but with global research efforts. And this question was very much at the top of the priorities of IFPRI, the International Food Policy Research Institute in those days. For the best agricultural land, food will be the highest value use of the land. What we have to avoid is artificially encouraging diversion of food from of land, the very high quality land, from production of food into production of biofuels. That's economically inefficient, but it's also unnecessary. In Europe and the US, where you've got strong mandates for production of ethanol, for example, mandatory requirements on production of ethanol, you did get a shift for a while away from food in the best agricultural land towards biofuels. That led to higher food prices, lower food production in those countries. That affected world markets for a while. That's not the way to do things. The economics tells us to focus the growing of biomass for industry and on land that is not the top quality land for food. There's plenty of that in Australia. Also, there's a very big opportunity in using agricultural, horticultural waste for industrial inputs. Generally, bioenergy is not going to be the best use of our biomass because energy will be most cheaply supplied by solar and wind with storage, but there'll be some uses of biomass for some specialised uses of energy, but not in general. It will be most valuable as an input into industries that require hydrocarbons and carbon. But if we follow the economics, that will keep the best agricultural land producing food. Land that's currently lower value in agricultural and pastoral activities will be devoted more heavily for sustainably growing biomass. In Australia, that gives us very big opportunities for growing biomass for a wide range of zero-carbon industrial uses.
Where's the love?
Well, it's love that binds communities. It's love of each other's of respect for other members of our community that will lead us to deal with the problem of climate change and to embrace the new opportunity.
Yeah, Professor Garnaut, this is related to the first question a bit and pertinent to this area. Do you have an estimate of how many hectares of solar panels might be required to achieve some of your goals, such as decarbonising Australia's electricity system and maybe even exporting hydrogen, green hydrogen? And are you concerned about the head of political steam and economic steam to do that, overriding concerns about tying up good agricultural farming land?
Yeah, I don't think we'll be putting... If the economics drive our decisions, then we won't be putting lots of solar panels on the best farming land. But there's plenty of Australia, including plenty of the good agricultural areas of Australia that's not necessarily the best farming land. For Australia to realise its immense opportunity would require very large-scale production of solar and wind power. We could be producing enough enough energy to export products with zero emissions that reduce the world's carbon emissions by about 8% of the total. To do this, we would cover 0.5% of Australia with solar panels. I talk about that in the book, The Superpower Transformation. And that's not going to be uniformly across Australia. We concentrated especially where first of all, where the sun and the wind is best, and that tends to be in highly decentralised areas. There are parts of Australia where communities are resistant to greater intensification of solar and wind power generation. There are many parts where the new industries are highly welcome. Then the smart thing for us is to focus on growth in the areas where it's most welcome. Australia is big enough and diverse enough for there to be different attitudes in different regions, so that the new industries have their strongest growth where they are most welcome.
As I entered the hall today, there was somebody from an anti-wind group giving me a brochure, and I know that in our area around the southern tablelands, there's considerable tension between landholders and solar developments, particularly around Goulburn. And this is because the solar farms that are proposed are directly under the existing high voltage infrastructure. And the argument about the loss of agricultural land is being addressed very adequately elsewhere in the world by combining both agriculture and solar through the design of new types of panels. Surely we can encourage people to increase their soil carbon between, underneath and around solar farms, and using good design for agrovoltaics. Is this something that your firms and your groups are considering, or is it just going out west?
Oh, I think that's a very important opportunity to improve the compatibility of the established agriculture and for example, solar and wind. Wind is usually not a big challenge for traditional agricultural production. Solar is more of a challenge. There are ways of making power generation more closely consistent with success in traditional agriculture. But I go back to my earlier point. Australia is big enough and diverse enough, and there are enough welcoming communities for us to achieve the superpower objective without forcing it on people and regions that, for one reason or another, are resistant to it.
Dr. Garnaut, when Burrendong Dam was built on the Macquarie River here that goes through Dubbo, it was built for many reasons, but one was to drought-proof the region. With our free trade policies, farmers grew cotton, and because that was the most profitable crop, and they're still doing so. Likewise with solar panels, if solar panels per hectare are more profitable than growing food on the best country, shouldn't we encourage the transmission lines to go further west into a drier area?
Yes, I think the transmission lines will need to be more extensive through Australia, in New South Wales, including further west, and I discussed that at some length in the book, The Superpower Transformation, we will need new areas of solar and wind production. They need not be the areas of highest value agricultural production, and you're quite right, putting in an optimally planned transmission system will open up other areas and make less acute the choice between food and energy production.
Ashley Bland here from Constructive Energy. I'm really interested in the interplay between transmission and distribution network, and in more particularly the role of the market in driving this transition. And you're an economist. We've heard you talk about efficient markets, but what we know looking back is that markets regularly have failings and failures. And it looks to me like this whole renewable energy transition is largely the remit of large industry and massive investments. We're focused on transmission networks when actually there's an enormous distributed opportunity for the likes of people in this room. But it looks like if we take our lead on the Murray-Darling Basin Plan, where you have a river system and a market mechanism there to deliver water, we know that the biggest companies with the deepest profit pockets make the most money out of that limited resource, and smaller operators up the river don't have access to water. It looks like the same sort of thing is happening in the energy market to me. You know, we've got massive international investment. We've got a lot of people in the space now specifically to make money, looking for large returns on large projects. I'm interested in your view. What's the role of governments and communities in optimising the socio-economic benefit to this? You know, how do we encourage a more distributed approach that perhaps advantages or at least creates space for a wider benefit rather than just the big end of town making all the money out of this transition?
Yeah, that is a wider, very important economic policy question of equitable distribution of the benefits of economic development. We haven't done a very good job of that in Australia in the last 2 decades. That huge mining boom that to service the Chinese economic growth has led to a situation where today more than half, or in the last quarter for which we've got national accounts, more than half of all of the profits of all industry in Australia is in mining, and only 2% of Australian employment is in mining, and we don't tax like a lot of other countries do the rents from high-value production of mineral products, and therefore we don't have the capacity that other developed countries like Norway have for providing wider community benefits from those products. So these are general economic policy questions that I think are very important, things that we have to think about. I think that naturally the energy story will be more widely distributed in Australia in the era of zero emissions industry than in the era of coal and oil and gas. But we still will need a focus on equitable distribution. That is an issue for governments. As I said in the answer to Karen's question at the beginning, the economically efficient supply of electricity to Australian farms won't always be simply tying up to the grid. And if the very large expenditures, often financed by government and subsidised by government in the grid, were available in similar proportions per head of population affected to decentralised production of power, we would find that many farms were able to achieve much lower cost power and as well as more reliable power from decentralised systems. That would require technical and management support, but provision of that would in the end be a more effective way of providing low-cost, reliable power to many distributed farms than maintenance of the very big existing transmission systems.